Sebastian Junger, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
This new book is fascinating, and I think you know where I'm going to start. I'd love to get you to tell your story of almost dying. And let me just say at the jump, I'm glad you didn't.
Thank you. Almost everyone else is as well. So I appreciate it. I had been a war reporter for a long time, years, decades in my life, and had become very close to dying a couple of times that I know of for sure. And I finally got out of that business and had a family. And when I almost died for medical reasons a few years ago, I had two young children. I came to fatherhood late. My entire life was a domestic one and a precious one to me. And I'm in good health, right? So I don't, I had never thought about my health because I've been an athlete my whole life. And one day, in mid-sentence, while talking to my wife in a cabin in the woods that we own in Massachusetts, I felt this pain shoot through my abdomen. And it was sort of unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And I said, wow, that's strange. I've never felt anything like this. And I stood up to try to walk it off. I thought it was a cramp or something. And I couldn't stand up. And I didn't know it, but my blood pressure was plummeting. I had a ruptured aneurysm. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my abdomen. And that's a ballooning in a weak spot in an artery. And it was a structural problem. It wasn't like clogged arteries or something. It was a completely structural problem. It was a freak thing. It's extremely rare. And it's a killer. It's a widowmaker. Right at that moment, I was looking at maybe a 30% chance of living. And that's if you get to the hospital fast. And I didn't. It took me an hour and a half. My wife had to drag me out of the woods until we got to we could get a cell phone signal and call the ambulance. And by the time I got to the ER, I was conscious, but my blood pressure was 60/40, and I was on the way out. And they barely saved me.
There's so much more to tell, but there's an expression that's coming to mind from my longtime meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, and it's not going to sound that impressive, but the more I've thought it over the years, the more it comes to mind frequently for me. And the expression is, anything can happen at any time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the psychological reality of that is twofold, I think. On the one hand, it could make you sort of hyper appreciative of every moment, because you're only here sort of, if you're religious, by the grace of God or by random circumstance. I mean, every moment of existence is a totally extraordinary thing. Or it can make you unbelievably paranoid. Like, okay, I'm alive at this moment, but I might be dead by dinner, for reasons I couldn't possibly predict. And I felt like I didn't know that this wouldn't happen to me again. And so I instead of being sort of shown the glory of existence, for a while, I just became very paranoid, and I felt like I was carrying around a live hand grenade, and that maybe another aneurysm could form that would kill me. And if I been in a traffic jam or on an airplane or on a camping trip, I would have died. I mean, I got to the hospital barely in time, and I can go through what they did to save me. It's really interesting. But as a sort of existential matter as a human being, it made me so aware of how lucky we all are to have even a moment of this, that it almost incapacitated me. I eventually climbed out of that, but it took a while.
Well, let's go back to the trauma bay for a second, where they're treating you, because I think you've described yourself up until that moment and maybe still as an atheist, but you had an experience that is hard to explain, although you're going to try to explain it now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a stone cold atheist, right? I mean, there is no religion in me, and at all. My father was a physicist, and not only am I an atheist, but I'm not sort of mystical either, right? There's no woo woo in me. I would say I'm anti-mystic. I mean, I eschew all that stuff, and still do, by the way, but sometimes things challenge our beliefs. And so I got to I started to feel better during the ambulance ride. I had no idea I was dying, but apparently I was going into something called compensatory shock. So I was losing a unit of blood, a pint of blood, into my own abdomen every 10 or 15 minutes, right? Like I was gushing blood. It was as if I'd been stabbed in the abdomen, except that instead of blood leaving my body, onto the floor, it stayed in my abdomen. And so what your body goes into compensatory shock to try to slow down the catastrophe. And it just clamps off access to your limbs, to your digestive system. Everything sort of stops, and it keeps the blood pooled where it's needed most. But your body can only do that for so long. And my body failed. The compensatory shock ended as soon as we got to the ER. And suddenly I went off a cliff. And I remember it happening. And I had no idea I was dying. But I knew something very, very bad was happening. And the doctors seemed very concerned. I was like, why is everyone I just have belly pain. Like, why is everyone so worried about me right now? I didn't understand it. And the doctor told me, he said, we need to put a large gauge needle straight into your jugular. And I was like, oh, that sounds like fun. Like, why? Why do you need to do that? And he said, in case there's an emergency. And he said, no, this is the emergency right now. Do I have permission? I said, yeah, okay. So we started working on my neck to get a large gauge needle into my jugular. And while he was doing that, my blood pressure was 60/40, which is the last step before you're dead. I mean, I was right at the end. And I'm lying in the trauma bay, and as he's working on me to get the needle in to transfuse me, this black pit opens up underneath me. And again, I don't know I'm dying, but I feel myself getting pulled into this pit, and I start to panic because I know if you go into the infinitely deep, dark pit, you're not coming out, right? Just some sort of animal knowledge, like don't go in there because you are not coming out if you do. And I started to panic. And as I started to panic, my dead father appeared above me and slightly to my left. And basically he was like, don't fight it. It's okay. You can come with me. I'll take care of you. He wasn't speaking exactly. He was communicating. And he wasn't like he was hanging up there suspended by theatrical wires. He was there in some sort of energy essence. I mean, very, very hard to explain in coherent terms. But his presence was there and he was communicating with me. It's okay. Don't fight it. I'll take care of you. I was horrified. I was like, go with you. You're dead. I'm not going with you. I'm alive. I'm staying here. We got nothing to talk about, Dad. And I love my father, right? I'm like, we got nothing. I'm not going with you. I was absolutely horrified. And I said to the doctor, because I'm still conscious at this point, I said to the doctor, you got to hurry. I'm leaving right now. I'm going. And then my memory is spotty after that. But basically, they got the needle in and they started transfusing me. And I needed 10 units of blood. It's a huge amount. That's basically all the blood in the human body. Over the next 12 hours or so, I needed a full 10 units. And then they rushed me into the interventional radiology suite where they fix the kinds of things that I have. I mean, the last ditch, if they can't find the bleed, the ruptured artery, is they open you up and they just start digging around in your abdomen trying to find the bleeding artery. And at that point, your odds of surviving are pretty poor. What they prefer to do is go in by catheter. And a catheter is a flexible rubber or wire line that they can insert into your venous system, into an artery or a vein. And they can go anywhere in your body. And they go through your groin, and that's where they enter. And then they loop all the way up, and they have a little camera on it, and they can put all these tools at the end of the catheter. And they were looking for the rupture, and they finally found, they couldn't find it, and they finally found it in the artery that feeds the pancreas. And then they couldn't, they found it, but they couldn't get the catheter all the way there. What they wanted to do was embolize the bleed, which means that they would leave something that looks like a pipe cleaner, and they leave it in the artery, and it collects blood, and the blood clots, and that plugs the artery, and then scar tissue forms around the clot. And then it's plugged forever, and you're good. You've stopped bleeding. They were trying to do that, and it took them about 6 hours. And, I'm in and out of consciousness. I'm not sedated because my vital signs were too low to be put under. And I started having these, occasionally really terrifying visions. I mean, again, I didn't know I was dying, and until finally the nurse said, "Mr. Younger, try to keep your eyes open." She was holding my hand. She said, "Try to keep your eyes open." And I said, "Why do you want me to keep my eyes open?" And she said, "So we know you're still with us." And I was like, "Oh, is it that kind of situation?" I had no idea. And I was in incredible pain. When blood comes into contact with your organs, it's very, very, it's called an insult to your organs, particularly your kidneys. And it's extremely painful. So I was in sort of like kidney stone level agony, and they couldn't really help me much. And then in the middle of all this, like around midnight, they kept trying to get the catheter to the bleed to embolize it and save me. And at one point, I saw one of the doctors sort of look up and shrug, basically like, "Well, we've tried everything. It's not working. There's nothing more we can do." And I caught that look between the doctors, and I just thought, "Oh my God, like, are you kidding? You guys don't have this? Like, what's happening right now?" And I realized at that moment I may not make it. I was so messed up medically that was a sort of abstract. It was terrifying, but it was also kind of abstract. But for the first time, I realized what the stakes were, and the stakes were my life, and that I might not make it home to my family. And then the other doctor said, "I know, why don't we try going through his left wrist instead of his groin, through his left wrist? Maybe that will allow another angle, allow access to this spot." And the first doctor said, "I like the way you think." And then that's what they did. And the final thing they would have tried is a emergency laparotomy in the surgery bay. They would have opened me up and just started searching for the bleed as fast as possible to embolize it before I bled out. And, it was sort of a race to the finish line at that point. And, the prognosis, the odds, once they open you up, the odds are, as I said, are pretty poor. And I very well might not have made it.
This is several hours of unbelievable pain. You used the word agony, not sedated, going in and out of consciousness. Am I right? Am I describing this correctly?
Yeah. Apparently they were able to give me a little bit of fentanyl, but not enough, because I was in agony. I kept telling the doctors, my back hurts so much. And doctors, they just ignore you, right? I mean, they got other things to do. They completely ignore you. And I couldn't believe they were ignoring me because I was in so much pain.
How'd they hold you still?
Well, I was holding myself still. I mean, I was on the table, and it was, it was a deep pain like kidney stones, but I wasn't thrashing around, and I mean, I don't know how that worked, but I was really, and the problem with that, like with kidney stones, the problem with that pain is I didn't know how long it would last. If someone said, "You're going to be in incredible pain for an hour," you just got to grit your teeth. Like, we could all make it an hour because we know, there's the finish line, right? But if someone says, "You're going to be in a lot of pain for an indefinite amount of time, and we'll just let you know when it ends," that will drive you mad, right? And it's very hard to take pain in those circumstances, and that's what I was looking at. And then I started to sort of hallucinate a little bit. And at one point, there was this arm of the machine above me, a fluoroscope. I was on a fluoroscope, and a fluoroscope basically is an X-ray machine that gives the doctors video X-rays, right? Like X-ray video of real time, so they can watch the catheter going through your venous system and see exactly where it is. And there's a lot of radiation in it. So like a few weeks later, I had a square radiation burn on my back from where I was lying on the plate. And radiation burns often come out a couple of weeks later. And I was sort of trying to make my poor wife sort of make her a little less scared of this thing. And I called it Square Noble. And she was like, "Don't even joke about Square Noble. Like, get out of here." They were working with they had me on a fluoroscope, and they're working with that. And in the arm that was over me, it had a kind of geometric shape to it. And And all of a sudden, that geometric shape looked like a face, like a sort of fierce Aztec face. It was absolutely terrifying. And it was right in front of me. And I was, mentally I was losing it, of course. And I was terrified of this face. And I felt like I was starting to enter a kind of hallucinatory realm where you're, sort of halfway between alive and dead and starting to have visions. And afterwards, I remember where I'd seen a face like that. I'd been on an assignment in Nigeria, and I'd been in Port Harcourt, which was a pretty troubled oil town in the Niger Delta, and a group called the MEND, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. They were Ijah warriors who would sort of descend on oil platforms and oil rigs and oil boats, oil ships in the Niger Delta and destroy them or take people hostage. And I was reporting a story on this in the Niger Delta, and these MEND warriors, these Ijah warriors, like descended on us in these speedboats in this little village and seized us and for a little while. And they were painted up in this crazy, crazy way. And their faces were painted with white chalk, war paint. And, one of them at one point said, we know you're a spy, and when the time comes to kill you, I will be the one to do it. And then he walked away. And when he told me that, I just remember thinking, do not let your knees buckle. Like, do not let these men see how scared you are. And so the face that I saw in the fluoroscope had the same sort of furious aspect as the chalk painting on these Ijah warriors who had, and then they let me go. I mean, they got permission and let me go. But that was a great trauma, and it sort of seared itself in my brain and then came back later in this moment of extremity.
Let me go back to your dad for a second. There's so much great writing in the book, but let me read. So I'll probably make a habit of what I'm about to do, which is reading you back to you and then getting you to talk about it a little bit. Here's your quote. He appeared when I needed him most. It was quite possibly his greatest act of love toward me. He was a distracted and distant father, a germaphobe who hesitated to pick up his own children and could disappear into his thoughts for hours at a time. And yet here he was. It's okay. You don't have to fight it. I'll take care of you. You can come with me. Can you just riff on that for a little bit?
My father, I realized later, I think he probably had spectrum disorder. He was a physicist. And a lot of physicists are God bless them, but they're sort of challenged in the human realm in a way that I think is sort of understood to be spectrum disorder now. And my father was definitely that way. And he just had a very hard time understanding and emotionally connecting to human beings, including his children. And he was a lovely man. He was brilliant. And I learned a lot from him, and I love him very, very much. But he was hard to connect to. And, I just realized later, like, after this happened, he showed up for me, and it wasn't clear that he was showing up for a lot of my childhood. I mean, he was there physically, but his mind was out there, as many physicists and mathematicians as they are. And there he was, like when I really, really needed him, he was above me. And, it's still for me an open question. Is this just a hallucination? Like, are these neurochemicals kicking in, producing a comforting vision? Is there something real here going on that we just don't understand how death works? And, that's what one of the inquiries in the book. And none of us have the answer to that. But I just will say on a personal level, that experience with him, after I got through the trauma of the whole thing, I realized, wow, like he came. Like I needed him and he came to take care of me. And it was an extremely, extremely powerful thing for me. And in some ways saved the whole experience from being just pure trauma.
I think for a quote unquote normal person, a civilian, and I use that term facetiously, this would have just been a thing that happened, but you're a journalist. And so it set you off on this exploration of, how do I explain as an atheist and a journalist what I experienced beyond the medical, beyond the pure medical explanation of why you got sick in the first place. And so I'm just curious, what did you learn about what science has to say or not say about these experiences?
Yeah, so my journey into that weird realm began the next day in the ICU. So I woke up in the ICU in the morning, and there was a nurse there, middle-aged woman, pretty heavy Boston accent. This happened on Cape Cod at the hospital in Hyannis, and she said, "Oh, good morning, Mr. Junger. You almost died last night. Congratulations, you're still alive. You made it. No one can believe you made it." And, indeed, the stats for what I had are like pretty grim. So and I didn't know that, of course. But I was absolutely shocked that I'd almost died. I had no idea. And then I remembered my father, and it all came back to me. And she walked out of the room, and I sat there thinking about, just in shock that I'd almost died. And, I have these two young children, and I was just sort of like, oh my God, I almost left them fatherless. I mean, I was just wrecked by this information. And my father and I saw my father, I couldn't believe it. And then this nurse came back about an hour later and said, Mr. Junger, how you doing? Sebastian, how you doing? And, I lied. I was doing terribly. I mean, my body, this is very, very hard on your body, what I went through. And I was throwing up blood, and I was a mess. And I lied. I said, well, I'm okay. But what you told me was really terrifying. Like, I had no idea I almost died. And she said, instead of thinking about it as something scary, try thinking about it as something sacred. And then she walked out of the room again. So having nothing else to do, I sat there with tubes coming out of me, thinking about her wisdom. And, what I came to was this, that I'd been allowed to go to the very edge of existence. I've been allowed to go to the edge and look over the edge at what's waiting for all of us. But instead of having to go, instead of having to leave this planet, I was allowed to come back. So what did I learn? I've been a frontline reporter for a long time. I go to these places of death and annihilation and desolation, and I come back and I write about what I learned, what people might need to know about this place. So this was just another version of a trip to the front line, the ultimate front line. So I came back and I recovered quickly. I'm, otherwise pretty healthy. And so I was out of the ICU in 5 days and home in a week. And, boom, suddenly I'm back at home as if nothing had happened. And the thing about what I had is that if you survive, it's not like a heart attack where there are these issues to deal with later that produce the problem. If you have a ruptured aneurysm and you survive, there's no issues. I mean, you're just like, you're done. You're good. You're as good as if it had never happened. So I got home and I started to I got very, very paranoid that maybe this is going to sound crazy, but I started to worry that I actually didn't make it, and I was a ghost. And I was looking at my family and that I actually wasn't there and that I didn't know I was dead. And I started to get into this crazy circular thing. Like, how do you know that you're not dead? And you can say to your wife, which I did, honey, just tell me I'm really here. Like, just tell me that I didn't die, that I'm not, that I'm here. And of course she said, honey, you're here. You're fine. Like, you're fine. We're all good. But in my mind, I'm like, that's exactly what a hallucination would say in a situation like that. Right? It's like, and you can drive yourself crazy, which I promptly did. And so my sort of investigation into all this began not so much as a journalistic enterprise, but as an attempt to sort of like calm my soul, calm my mind, because I got into a very, very strange, crazy place. And I thought if I read about this, maybe it'll sort of comfort and reassure me. Information is reassuring, right? So information's always helpful. So it turned out that there's a lot that what happened to me is very, very common. And 25% of people that have a heart attack and die and are brought back or survive or almost die, something like a quarter of them have visions very much like what I had, and they often see the dead. And this didn't happen to me because I actually never medically died. My heart never stopped. But often when someone's heart stops, their memory of that is that they're actually on the ceiling looking down at the doctors trying to save this person who they don't even realize is them. And they're like, oh my God, that's me. I'm not up here. That's me. And so the subjective experience of dying in retrospect is extremely confusing. And the point of view of the dead person does not stay within the body. It's very mysterious, right? So as I'm doing my research and I'm sort of rooting for the afterlife, right? Because at this point I'm terrified, and I'm like, oh, maybe, and keep in mind I'm an atheist, right? So I don't have God to turn to, and people ask me later, like, oh, after your experience, do you believe in God? You're right, and I'm like, look, I didn't see God, I saw my dad. Like, I mean, it's possible that there's some kind of after existence, and there's still no God, right? It's also possible that there's a God. But God created completely biological beings, us, and when we died, that's it, and there's no nothing afterwards. Like, both are possible. So, and a quote, afterlife and God are not this one and the same thing, and they don't require each other, right? So, at any rate, I'm redoing my research, and I'm starting. I can feel myself rooting for an afterlife, and I'm like, oh yeah, I read some case where someone was dying, and then very often, and my mother did this, my father did this as well. It's very, very common in hospice that the dying will see the dead in their room, and that hours before they die, they will be talking to dead people who are there to receive them, right? And no one else can see these people. It's very, very common, and when in several cases, the dying person is talking to someone who died very recently, and they don't know that. In other words, they're talking to someone who they didn't know had just died. Like, how do they know that, right? And so there's some seriously mysterious questions about how the hell does this all work? Like, what happens on the threshold of death exactly that seems to give the dying a kind of universal knowledge? And so anyway, I'm reading this stuff, and I'm starting to be comforted by the idea of an afterlife. And then you read the counterpoints by the rational people, by the doctors, by the scientists, and they're like, look, we can explain all of this through neurochemistry, through epileptic seizures in the temporal lobe. Like, they have all of these medical explanations for all the phenomena, all the near-death phenomena, and they say, and this is worth taken seriously and considering because it's tested and true. Virtually all of the near-death experiences that people experience can be reproduced in other ways through low blood oxygen, epilepsy, endogenous DMT and ketamine in the body, all these things, right? So here's the argument. My father was a supreme rationalist. My mother was sort of a mystic. She was an artist. She loved to believe in energies and past lives and all that other stuff. And then there's my dad, who was a physicist. And he'd like, come on, Ellen was my mother's name. He's like, come on, that's ridiculous. That makes no sense. So what I was seeing in the literature was an argument that I heard played out my entire childhood between my rationalist father and my sort of like romantic and mystical mother. And now I'm reading this argument that frankly society has been having for hundreds and thousands of years. And basically the conclusion I came to was that a lot of this, everything about all these visions that people have can be explained through neurochemistry, can be explained rationally, except for one thing. And it's basically this: if you give a room full of people LSD, you know that they will all have hallucinations. 100% of them will have hallucinations because that's what LSD does in the human brain. But they will not all have the same hallucination, right? They will not all see a waterfall or whatever, right? When people die, the hallucination that they have, not every time, but an enormous fraction of the time, is that they see the dead. The dead come for them. Even people that they don't know are dead, right? And we know this from survivors' accounts. And that one fact, like, why is it that only the dying see the dead? the doctors, the families, the relatives, no one else sees like Aunt Maud up in the ceiling, right? When my mother died, as she was dying, she looked up and she scowled and she said, "What's he doing here?" She was furious about it, and she had an estranged brother named George. And I just took a guess. I said, "Mom, that's George. That's Uncle George, and he's come a very, very long way to see you, and you have to be nice to him." And she scowled and she said, "We'll see about that." Right? So it's not even, one of the theories is that the dying sort of hallucinate the dead as a way to self-comfort, self-soothe, because they know they're dying. I mean, but it doesn't quite work either, right? Because a lot of people who are dying don't know they're dying, right? And a lot of people see the dead like me and are not very happy to see the dead. It's not a comforting vision. It's horrifying, right? So that opens up, the book is divided into two sections, what and if. The what part is what happened to me. The if part is, what if there were something that we don't understand that happens after we die that doesn't conform to our understanding of reality, of the atomic worlds, of the macroscopic world? What if there's some reality we don't understand? And I liken it to this. I say we might have the same understanding of reality that a dog has of a television screen. And that's where I go into the realm of my father. He was a physicist. And there are some ideas, some conversations about a post-death reality that are in the realm of quantum physics, which is an infinitely mysterious realm that's not understood by scientists. It's understood well enough to know that there is a completely contradictory mystery going on at the quantum level that it totally contradicts what we understand about the macroscopic level that we live in. And that I sort of finished the book with, that may be where the answers lie about these post-death experiences that we just don't understand.
In what way would the quantum realm hold the answers to these mysteries?
I mean, I'm going to try to explain this briefly and simply because it is quantum physics, and no one lasts very long in a conversation about quantum physics. So, as I understand it, there are a couple of fundamental mysteries, contradictions in the quantum world that thoroughly spooked people like Schrödinger and Einstein, who sort of discovered them and didn't understand them. And one is known as the double slit experiment. So if you shoot photons, which are subatomic particles, if you shoot photons at a pair of slits, if you don't observe the photon while it's heading towards the slits, it will pass through both at the same time, and we know that because of the signature on the strike plate on the other side. So one particle will go through two slits at the same time. In the macroscopic world, you cannot walk through two doorways at the same time. We all know that, right? At the quantum level, a particle can. It has been described as a statistical smear where it's all things. It's all possible outcomes until it's observed by a conscious entity, humans, at which point it has to pick a slit, and it can only go through one. And that's the sort of mystery of the double slit experiment. And then it gets weirder because they found that particles can be what are called entangled. And that means that entangled particles can be separated by a foot, by a mile, or by the entire universe. And they act simultaneously in identical ways. And if you subject one entangled particle to a force, the other one reacts simultaneously, which means that some kind of quantum information is traveling faster than the speed of light. The speed of light is fast, but it's not instantaneous. It makes no sense at all. And then finally, they've done something called delayed choice quantum erasure, Well, they take entangled particles and they send one through a double slit while watching it, and it has to pick one, and then another through a double slit not watching it, and then it picks both slits. But because they're entangled, they have to do the same thing. And what happens with the results is that somehow time goes backwards, as it were, and the results are rectified to be identical in a way that is not understandable by humans. And they don't know how this works or why it works. So that is my civilian attempt to explain quantum physics. I'm sure I absolutely slaughtered it if any physicists are listening. But that's the sort of essence of this mystery. And so what scientists have done with this information is present a theory where consciousness becomes part of the physical manifestation of the universe. What they know is that when you observe something, the quantum world, instead of being a statistical smear of all possibilities, it becomes one thing. And that it's possible that when consciousness arose in the universe, it might have been us, it might have not been us, who knows? But when consciousness arose in the universe, it forced the universe to become one thing instead of all things. And that poses the question of, is consciousness a part of the physical manifestation of the universe, like gravity? Without gravity, there is no universe. It doesn't cohere. It doesn't work in physical terms. And it's possible that without consciousness, the same thing would happen. We would not have the universe that we have, and it gets really, really out there. But there's a theory called biocentrism, where the entire universe is a consciousness. And, there's no way to prove or disprove this. And so biocentrism is sort of like treated very skeptically by sort of straight ahead physicists, because you can't test for it. But, it may be that testing for a universal consciousness requires the consciousness testing itself, and which may be a logical impossibility. So you get tangled up. It's sort of like a existential game of Twister, and then finally you can't put your arm around behind your back and you're stuck, right? And so that's sort of where we're at. But that might provide some answers to, when you die, you enter a sort of quantum level existence, and which intersects with the macroscopic existence that we live in ways that we just don't understand.
That was the best explication of quantum physics I've ever heard on this show, or perhaps anywhere. And maybe it's because you have no idea what you're talking about, but it definitely landed for me in ways that previous attempts did not.
Thank you.
The 10% Happier podcast is available ad-free over on our companion meditation app, which is also called 10% Happier. And you will get the episodes a week before everybody else does. Download the 10% Happier app right now to get started for free. Let me just go back to the sharp end of the stick there, which is, what does all of that have to do with all these questions about what happens after we die? Is it, and I'm sorry, this may be I might make myself an object of ridicule by saying this, but is there something like about the multiverse at work here, that somehow consciousness comes into play in the universe and that forces everything to become one thing, and therefore there may be lots of one things with different consciousnesses, and those are realms of existence where other versions of us are living, and perhaps dead people too?
Yeah, this is in the realm of, like, you can't test for it, so it doesn't sort of mean anything, but there's no reason not to discuss it, right? So yeah, the multiverse, as I understand it, is that, the one thing there's plenty of in the universe is space-time, and it's basically unbounded. So you could have an almost infinite number of universes that include every single possibility at the quantum and atomic level, macroscopic level, including you did or didn't order the chicken sandwich yesterday. It could, and there's no space problem. There's no sort of like storage problem in space, right? It's an infinity. So you're not going to run out of space for all of these permutations of reality to happen. And so, yes, it does have something to do with the multiverse. the way I understand it, it's very tricky talking to physicists about physics because they're explaining it to you in physicist terms, which as an ordinary human you're not gonna understand. And what I had to do, the reason that our conversation might be a little easier on both of us is that I'm not a physicist, and I tried to understand these concepts in sort of quote civilian terms. And when I tracked down an old colleague of my father's, again trying to find sort of solace and clarity in all this, and I told him, I said, two of these guys actually, I had lunch with them, and I explained to them what happened, and I said, what are the odds of my father just appearing above me? I just figured that was an unanswerable question. I was trying to be like, I don't know, a little funny maybe. I was like, what are the odds of Dad appearing like above me in the trauma bay? And the thing about physicists is they're completely literal, right? So one of them sort of like looked up at the corner. He was like, what are the odds? And he actually gave me a number. I was like, what? Like 10 to the minus 60? Like, how did you get that number? And he said, well, it's the same as the odds of all the oxygen molecules in the room randomly collecting in one little corner of the room and asphyxiating us. There's some odds of that happening. They're just incredibly small. And those are the odds of your dad appearing, and so I was like, okay, so you guys really, it's all numbers, huh? Is that the world is just all numbers? And it was sort of an extraordinary, like, glimpse into the mind of a mathematician or of a physicist. And so they're looking at the universe like this, and they, basically in an infinity of times, all things happen because it's infinity. And all things inevitably might include the universe coming into existence. It may just be that simple. Like, you give me an infinity of time, eventually every single thing will happen, including one unimaginably huge thing, which is the universe coming into existence, going from a Planck length, which is the smallest subatomic distance possible, going from a Planck length to a universe hundreds, thousands, millions of light years wide in an amount of time too small to measure. That's what happened when the universe was created. And it may simply be a function of an infinity of time allowing for every single possible thing eventually will occur.
So it seems like the punchline, the conclusion you landed on, is that it is unlikely there's an afterlife, but it's unlikely there's a universe in the first place, so who the fuck knows?
That would be a good summation. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, you just sort of think about, what are we doing here? My father hovering above me is the least of it, right? The universe existing is inconceivably unlikely. And I don't have the numbers in my head. They're in my book, and my memory's not that good. But they are, the chance of the universe existing as it does is, there's like, I think 30 or 40 values in physics that have to be exactly what they are. The attractive force between an atom and an electron, and the force of gravity, and all these are sort of arcane things, have to be exactly the values they are to allow for this universe to exist. And that those odds are, going from memory, they're the odds of finding one grain of sand, the one grain of sand you're looking for in all the grains of sand on Earth, the first time. It's those odds, except millions and millions of times less likely than that. That's what the odds are of you, me, and this entire thing existing at all. Okay? So in that context, my father appearing above me in a form that the human brain doesn't or can't understand after he died, it's conceivable because the universe is almost inconceivable, right? It's just like it pales in comparison to any of this. And so, will that comfort people on their deathbed? Probably not. But it did make me, I'll say this, and I remain an atheist, but it did make me think that, in my research, a lot of these physicists believed in a sort of universal consciousness. A lot of, they believed in a transition at death that actually was strangely similar to the kind of visions that visions found in religious enlightenment, sometimes in dreams, in the shamanic experience. Like there's a sort of like similarity in all these transcendent experiences. And they are sort of echoed by some of the opinions of these physicists, like Schrödinger, for example. And so it made me, the comfort it sort of gave me was that it's possible when we die, instead of it being an ending of something, of our individuality, it's an infinite expansion of our individuality. In other words, we are joining something more than we're leaving something. And that idea, total conjecture, no way to prove it or even test for it, obviously. But it was something that some extremely smart people who were themselves the pioneers of quantum physics eventually came to as a conclusion about reality and the universe. If that's comfort for you, like, I'm glad of it. And that's as close as I can get myself to a reassuring vision of what happens.
I have not thought about this deeply, so what I'm about to say could be really, almost guaranteed to be cultish and awkward and ungainly and embarrassing. On the level of our atoms, we are definitely inextricably a part of the universe, and we will return to dust and ashes, et cetera, et cetera. And on the level of our consciousness, who knows, but consciousness is nature too. And so we are going to return to something greater. We are actually right now part of something greater. That whether there's another realm where my dead grandfather lives, I have no idea, but interconnection seems non-negotiable.
Well, here's the thing about consciousness, and that, that itself is a very hard thing to arrive at a firm conclusion about. It's hard to even define what consciousness is. But the people who study consciousness argue endlessly about what actually it is. One definition is the ability to imagine yourself in the future. But that's one of many definitions. But so our understanding of consciousness is that it's a product of the brain, which is a biological reality. And if you destroy the brain, you destroy consciousness. Presumably. The problem, though, is that consciousness, right, that's a product of the biological brain and our vision and our senses, that when this brain observes quantum phenomena, it changes them simply by knowing what's happening. And the brain creates the physical world that it inhabits, right? So it gets very, very circular because the brain is made out of physical stuff, right? It's made out of cells. But the physical reality at the quantum level seems to be created by consciousness observing it. So consciousness is creating the physical reality that then becomes the stuff that the brain is made out of, that is observing and creating the physical reality. So, how many times do you want to go around that circle? So we don't know, does reality come from consciousness, or does consciousness spring from physical reality? Like, it's sort of both. And that's where the enduring mystery is. And so you're right. Like, yeah, consciousness seems to float sort of apart, sort of float around apart from our physical reality, except that if you put a bullet through your head, you're provably no longer conscious. Your EEG goes to zero, flatlines. There are no detectable thoughts going on in your damaged brain. But then what do you do with the fact that the consciousness is required for reality to take the form that it takes, including to create the bullet that went through your brain that destroyed your brain? And so we just don't, that's what I mean by our understanding of reality might be as simplistic and as flawed as a dog's understanding of a television set. Like we just may have no idea or not be neurologically capable of having an idea of the larger framework around this TV set that seems to be so fascinating.
Well, I guess when I was spewing words out of my mouth hole a few minutes ago, what I was getting at wasn't necessarily the nature of reality per se, but your idea of comfort. And I find it comforting to know whether consciousness requires a brain or whether it's non-local or whatever the term of art is. It's still a natural phenomenon. It has to be, right? And so everything I'm experiencing, every body part I think I own, it's all part of nature. And it's all going back into nature when I die. And I guess what I'm getting at is you don't have to believe in anything metaphysical, esoteric, unprovable, et cetera, to derive some comfort from that.
Right. And I think where people get hung up, or where I get hung up is, you mean there's an afterlife where I will continue to think as me for eternity, and I'm going to get to see my dead friend, and it's just going to be a big party with everybody, right? Like, isn't that that there's the afterlife includes a individual identity that continues on for eternity? That's a simplistic idea of the afterlife, and I know that's not what you're talking about. But I think that's where people get sort of sidetracked because they want something comforting where, okay, I'm going to die, but I get to keep going, right? Like that's not just because I shed my body doesn't mean that this is over. But when you talk about the soul, and I'm using the soul as the clumsy substitute for whatever it really is, and I'm not religious, but bear with me. You would really have to be talking about something that doesn't have a conscious individual identity. You would really have to be talking about a manifestation of some kind of universal consciousness that manifests as what you perceive to be yourself as an individual, and then when you die, it goes back into the universal consciousness that all of the universe is composed of, or affected by, determined by, created by. On that level, it's sort of conceivable in physical terms, but not the, oh, great, now I get to just go on without my body, and it will be so nice to see grandma. Like that's probably not what's on the menu.
But isn't that unitive experience, isn't that, and I'm talking not now about the I, Dan, you, Sebastian, get to go on in our current conscious form in some other realm. The idea that we are woven into some universal whole, which again is not mystical. It's just obvious. We get molecular experience of that if we get the right dose of psilocybin. And it seems to be the core of all mystical experiences, exogenous molecules or not. And so I think it is properly understood, comforting. People come out of those experiences, at least at first there's some terror, and then for some people, and then eventually it's deeply comforting.
It is. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about it. I mean, I didn't die. My heart didn't stop. And I was terrified, and I was horrified that my father was there. Had my heart stopped, I might have thrown myself into his arms. Like, oh my God, it's so good to see. I mean, I don't know like what I was deprived of. The part that I got was the scary part. And it might have changed had the doctors failed in their attempts and had I actually died. So I interviewed a former forest firefighter in Montana who was, a guy in his early 70s, I think, obviously very fit guy. He was out hunting with his son in the mountains of Montana. And suddenly he got the same thing I had. He had abdominal hemorrhage. And is trying to get him to safety. His son dislocated his shoulder. So the two of them are very, very compromised, and he had a slower bleed than I did, but they had to spend the night by a campfire in the wilderness, sub-freezing temperatures, and then his son left on foot to try to get help and left the father there, and the father was lying in this field and realizing, my son's going to survive, but I'm not. And he started to have these visions, and the visions were the mountain started rippling, and he could see all of these animals and the souls of animals. And he realized, oh, the animals are going to die. I'm going to die. We're all part of the same thing. We're all part of the mountains. We're part of the world, part of the universe. And it was an incredibly comforting thing. And of course, he didn't survive, or we wouldn't know. He did survive, or we wouldn't know this. Help got to him in time, and they saved his life. But that sort of like what would otherwise seem like a drug trip, right? Like, oh my God, we're all, I was lying in a field and I became one with the animals. I mean, that just sounds like someone who's taken a hit of LSD, except that is a very, very common vision or illusion, as you will, that people have when they're dying. And it's extremely comforting. And it makes, now because it's comforting doesn't mean that that's what's actually going to happen to us. But it is comforting. And, there's nothing good about human suffering or any sort of suffering. And if people's suffering can be alleviated by a hallucination, I'm good with that. So much the better. And the truth is, it may not even be a hallucination. It may actually be a glimpse at a form of reality that we can't understand, but that we are all headed towards. Who knows?
Well, that leads me to my question, which is, for you, on a molecular level, forget what you've learned. What do you suspect?
Because of this, I've learned to say, I don't know, we don't know. Like, I started out as an atheist thinking, come on, you died, that's it. Enjoy life while you have it. Like, and anyway, universal, infinite, an eternity of consciousness kind of sounds like hell. Like, I couldn't even get through math class in high school, right? Like 50 minutes of math class. You're going to give me an eternity of consciousness? Like, thank you, no. So part of the sort of cynical part of me was like, all right, I'm good with it. And now because of my experience, I think, wow, I don't know. Like, I just don't know. I no longer have certainty. I can easily imagine a reality, a quantum reality, where consciousness is so determinative of physical reality that we as living creatures, conscious living creatures, are part of that and return to it in a way that we don't have sort of awareness and consciousness of, but that we get subsumed back into the sort of the fabric of consciousness in the universe that determines the nature of the universe, and that we rejoin that. And I have some comfort in saying that, intellectual comfort in saying that, because some of the smartest people I've ever heard of, which are these physicists starting in the sort of 19-teens, 1920s, who pioneered all this work, including Einstein, pioneered all this work in quantum physics. That was and Schrödinger, that was more or less where they sort of landed about reality. And so I'm like, I'll go with those guys. Like that, like, that's not a bad bet. And but again, the sort of individual survival, I really sort of reject. And even on the just sort of logical level of there's something called entropy, which is the increase in disorder in the universe. And the laws of entropy mean that all the energy that's stored in the universe from the Big Bang, it's a huge battery, and eventually it runs down, and it runs down to absolute zero. And it will take, I can't remember the number, but it will take many, many tens of billions of years, and eventually the universe will have absolutely no molecular or atomic movement at all, absolutely no heat, no time, no nothing, right? That's what happens when you deprive the environment of all traces of energy and heat. And the idea that a soul could survive in a maximum entropy environment when the universe itself can't survive. Like, we're not going to survive anything the universe doesn't, and the universe will die. We know that for a fact. So at the end of the day, like, our souls are, whatever souls are tied to the universe, and that's headed off a cliff eventually. So, I don't know, is that dismal or is that is that comforting? I don't know.
The bet you would make is that there's some unfathomable soup of consciousness out there that we will return to, and in this form, we're just like a ladle, one little ladle full of that soup that we're in this incarnation right now on Earth. So that does not, that bet that you're saying you would make, that doesn't comport neatly with the vision of your dad. So maybe your suspicion is that the vision of your dad was a useful hallucination?
Yes, it could have been a useful hallucination. Although, again, I didn't know I was dying, and I was not at all happy to see him. But the quantum information associated with my dead father, whatever even that even means, the idea that as you die and you transition to a non-physical consciousness, if that indeed is what happens, that there starts to be some interchange between the two at this moment of transition. I mean, conceivably, right? So I just don't think we're smart enough to actually answer a question like yours in precise terms. I should also add, and this is another very, very mysterious, the other very mysterious and troubling part of my experience. So, like I said, I've been an athlete my whole life. My heart rate's 60 beats a minute. My blood pressure's whatever. I'm no reason to worry about my health, and I've been that way my whole life, and never had to think about my body and in concerned terms. And about 6 months before this happened, I started to get this odd pain in my abdomen. Apparently, when aneurysms get to a certain size, they're asymptomatic, but sometimes they can be painful. And particularly if they're near the pancreas, which mine was, which is super rare. I mean, what I had is really, really rare. But I started to get this sort of pain. And so it was bearable, right? So, of course, because it was bearable, I ignored it. And I just thought nothing that's bearable can kill you, right? Like, if you can bear it, then it's not a danger, which is completely false, right? Utterly, completely false. But, for 6 months off and on, I had this just strange pain that was sort of debilitating for a few minutes at a time, then it would kind of lift. 36 hours before I almost died, I had a dream. And in my dream, this was dawn the day before the day I almost died, about 36 hours before. And it was just getting light outside. And I had a dream of a sort that I've never had before. I have never even heard of anyone having before. I had a dream that I was dead. And I was above my family, floating exactly like my father had floated above me 2 days later, 36 hours later in the trauma bay. I was above my family, and they were grieving. My 2 little girls and my wife, and they were grieving me. And I was like, hey, I'm here. I'm fine. I'm right here. Look. And they couldn't hear me, and they couldn't see me. And I was made to understand, not through words. I can't even explain how I was made to understand this, but I was made to understand that I died, that there was no going back. This was irrevocable. And that I died out of sort of carelessness. And that I hadn't taken my life seriously. I hadn't taken things seriously. And as a result, I died. And now it was too late to go back. And I was just annihilated with remorse. I mean, I was just devastated. And I want to go back. And I was getting pulled away from them. And I was getting sent into a huge, huge circle through the universe that I would never return from. And in this moment of incredible anguish, I woke up. And we co-sleep. My wife and I co-sleep with our children. And so at that point, my little girl, Aisha, happened to be right next to me we have a pad on the floor, and we all just sleep on it like we're camping or something. And I woke up next to my daughter, and oh, thank God, that was just a dream. Here I am, I'm okay. And I, put my arm around her and sort of, touched my wife. I was like, oh, thank God. That was just, and I have no explanation for how I knew that I was going to die. Absolutely none. And but that dream became a source of paranoia because I started to think maybe I did die. Maybe my dream was actually that I did die. And this right now is a hallucination. The trip to the hospital, coming out of the ICU, everything right up until now is a hallucination, the hallucination of a dying man. And I can't tell the difference. And, frankly, there's no answer to that. I mean, there's no empirical answer like, no, we can prove otherwise. Like, that's actually not true. And it could have happened. And almost dying is very traumatic. It was way, way more traumatic than anything I've experienced in combat. Way more traumatic. And, I just sort of worked my poor brain into a pretzel thinking about this stuff.
This is an unusual interview for this show because normally this show is intensely practical. We do some biographical stuff and some theoretical stuff sometimes, but generally speaking, the emphasis is on the practical. And now, with very little time in this remaining in this interview, I'm gonna try to turn us there because you do talk about sort of what we can learn from your experience and operationalize in our daily lives. And just off the top of my head, I think some of those lessons would be, gratitude, awe, which is linked to gratitude, I think, and love. Let me read one more passage from the book back to you, and then maybe I'll stop talking and you can say whatever you want to say. You're referring in this passage to a camping trip that you remember taking with your dad. I'm now much older than he was that night, and I finally understand how much my father must have trusted me on that trip, how much he must have loved me. We're all on the side of a mountain, shocked by how fast it's gotten dark. The only question is whether we're with the people we love or not. There is no other thing, no belief or religion or faith. There is just that, just the knowledge that when we finally close our eyes, someone will be there to watch over us as we head into that great soaring night.
That's referring to something that happened when I was about 16. I went into the woods a lot when I was a kid. I went camping a lot. My father was a European-born physicist and had never slept outside. And when I was 16, I was like, we're doing it, Dad. We're going camping. And I took him off into the White Mountains in the fall and in New Hampshire. And, we were way up and all alone. It started to get dark and he got hypothermia. It got very, very cold. And I was 16. We had no way of getting out of there. And I was like, I got to make this work. And so I put him in a sleeping bag and got a fire started and got some warm soup into him and sort of brought him back. But for a while, it was like I was the parent, like I was the father and he was the child. And then as he warmed up, as he sort of came back to health, he resumed being my father. And I went back to being his 16-year-old kid. But for a little while, I was looking out for him. And then, of course, if you're a parent, you watch your children fall asleep all the time. And one of the things, they know you're there. And that's one of the reasons they can relax enough to go to sleep. Like there's this profound comfort. And then, there I was on the trauma bay doing my own version of going to sleep. And then there was my father looking out for me. And this is the baton that human beings, generations of human beings hand off to each other as we go around the track in life. He's like, I will take care of you when you need me most, and I'm going to be taken care of. And we just keep doing that. And, that is salvation. Whether we are just biological beings and we end utterly and completely when we die, and it's a completely physical universe that has no transcendent meaning whatsoever, and then it's going to flare out like a Roman candle and go dead and dark in 30 billion years, whatever. Or if there's something more, something we're connected to, something completely transformative that happens when whatever it is, the fact that we take care of each other when we need each other most, that is what saves us psychologically and physically It's what makes life worth living. And it may, frankly, be the most essential component of existence. So do not miss out on it. Do not miss out on the moment. Like right now, you don't get the past, and you don't, sure as hell don't get the future. You get right now, and it's all you're ever going to get. Do not spend it on your phone, right? Do not spend it watching TV. Do not, be here right now. That's life. What I've realized, having almost died, that is the only way to live that honors this extraordinary freak show that is the universe.
Do you think your behavior has changed subsequently?
Yeah, I'm way more, whatever. I mean, I don't have a smartphone on purpose. I have a flip phone, so that keeps me off of that damn thing. We don't own a television. I've done a lot, and I never have. So we don't, those distractions are not in our lives anyway. But it's a sort of Zen practice. Like, okay, be here now. Like, what's happening right now? Maybe it sucks. Maybe I don't like this very much, but it's actually better than not existing at all. Here I am with my child. Like, what do you think life's for, asshole? Like, come on, wake up. Like, you're getting all of it right now, right? It doesn't matter if you're in a traffic jam, right? Like, traffic jam's better than nothing. So enjoy the traffic jam. And so you can get to that. And there is some real vision and wisdom and comfort in experiencing traffic jams like that.
I mean, 1,000%. I'm going to, again, in our remaining time, read back to you some of the passages I liked. And this one, I think, picks up on what you just said. You write about how the flip side of terror is reverence. If you're not sufficiently reverent, you're not sufficiently terrified, and vice versa. My appreciation for the current moment rose to such levels, and now you're speaking about the aftermath of your near-death experience, rose to such levels that it could be almost paralyzing. There was virtually no activity that couldn't come grinding to a halt because I realized all over again how unlikely the whole thing was. Why wasn't everyone crying all the time over this? I thought. Have you seen the trees? Really seen them? Or the clouds? Or the way water droplets form digital patterns on the porch screen after it rains? Religious people understand life is a miracle, but you don't need to sub it out to God to be rendered almost mute with wonder. Just stand on a street corner and look around for a while.
Exactly. I don't know what to add to that. That's, if you can go through life even doing that once in a while, you're going to be living life in a slightly different way than you were before. And look, when you're young, there's this sort of like the rush and tumult of life and the heartaches and this and that. Of course, you get caught up in these transitory experiences. And then, I think as you get older, you may slow down a bit. But really, ultimately, at any age, if you can just stop and engage with the kind of awe that you were allowed to exist, like if you can just do that, it makes almost everything okay. And with the exception, I think, and of course, I don't have this by experience, thank God, but in my imagination, the only thing that I think might be impervious to that is the death of a child. If something happened to one of my children, I don't think I could apply any of this. I think there'd be absolutely nothing, and for me, and I didn't put this in the book, but in my thoughts, I'm like, I finally, having always derided the idea of heaven and all that stuff, like, oh, come on, that's so lame, Now that I have children, I understand where that idea comes from. It's something bad happened to someone's kid, and they have a desperate need to believe that child went someplace good. And I completely get that. And I for one, am not going to repudiate it because I think it's just too badly needed.
What about the value of contemplating our mortality? Do you have a view on that after everything you've been experienced and now written?
Of course, like our mortality is the most defining thing about us. Like if we never died, if we were eternal, our lives would have no meaning because there'd be no choices, there'd be no limitations. All things could happen eventually in an eternity of time. The whole thing becomes meaningless. The fact that we die is what makes us, and what makes life sacred and important. And so if you don't think about that once in a while, you're kind of missing out on something essential about yourself and about reality. but it can be paralyzing. I mean, I got to the point where I was sort of paralyzed by it, and I don't know if there's a diagnosis for that kind of psychological trouble. There should be, because I really struggled for a while. And, I think the trick is to find a balance where you're properly appreciative of your existence and not so mesmerized by it that you can't function. And, I think there's a lot of sort of evolutionary history that has gone into, as our brains developed from chimpanzees. We departed from chimpanzees 6 million years ago. Our brains got more and more complex. Now we have a real understanding of ourselves as individuals, which allows us to speak, allows us to think into the future, makes us super adaptive as a species. The only problem is when you understand that you're an individual, you inevitably understand that you're going to die. And then that's this crushing weight that can destroy you psychologically. So humans have figured out this way of sort of like not thinking about it too much so that they have the benefits of individuality without, having this sort of existential hammer come down on their head. And the trick for all of us, I think, is to sort of navigate between those two poles. So you're not going through life oblivious and you're not going through life paralyzed. And I think religion is one of the things that helps people with that. I just chose not to use religion as a way to get there.
Could you just remind everybody of the name of your book and anything else you've put out into the world that you want to direct them to?
Sure. So the name of my book is In My Time of Dying by Sebastian Junger. And the subtitle is How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. It comes out on May 21st. And I have many other books out there, starting with The Perfect Storm. My last book was called Freedom, about how freedom works and why it is so precious in the human experience.
This was an extremely interesting and enjoyable interview. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.